is an India Today exclusive. A lot is happening when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war. We're beginning the year with a fresh offensive by the Israeli forces when it comes to Gaza. What are the repercussions really going to be? Because we're seeing attacks within Lebanon, as also taking out Hamas leaders in other parts of the world, as has been instructed by the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm being joined by Richard Goldberg, who is a senior advisor with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, that's FDD. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us here on India Today. You have a lot when it comes to your profile and how you've dealt on strategic matters. Let's begin with what has happened in the past few days, which is one, the attacks in Beirut, which has taken out senior Hamas leadership, and the will of or the intent of Israel to ensure that Hamas is eliminated. Firstly, where do you see this action and the ramification of it from Lebanon, given that we're seeing some very strong statements coming from Hezbollah?
Well, I think the strike in Lebanon on al-Aruri, who was the number 3 in command of Hamas, one of the masterminds of October 7th, was a very targeted strike, very pinpoint. If you look at the damage photos, you can see the missiles that went straight into different floors of a building, no real collateral damage to speak of. And so the Israelis have signaled this was a strike on Hamas, not on Hezbollah, which is why I think you have not seen a major response out of Lebanon so far. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be conflict that continues to escalate between Israel and Hezbollah. Remember, Hezbollah is still an Iranian terror organization, just like Hamas, only it's 10 times larger, has 150,000 rockets instead of the 15,000 we estimate Hamas has. And so Israel, after October 7th, is living in a bit of a new reality where they don't want to have Iranian proxies on their border. They don't want northern communities to wake up one day to the same horror that those around the Gaza border woke up to on October 7th. And so I think you're going to see the Israelis get serious, potentially about military action, to drive Hezbollah farther from that northern border. And of course, we're dealing with other threats in the region at the same time, all sponsored by Iran. India is not escaping these threats. We've seen the maritime threats that are coming all the way into the Indian Ocean from Iran and its proxies launching missiles, launching drones against maritime shipping. And so ultimately, this is going to come down to whether or not the United States and its allies have the resolve to restore deterrence, not just against Hamas or Hezbollah, but against Iran, which is behind all of these threats.
Well, a very important point. I was coming to Iran, but we'll broad-base the question a little. Houthis of Yemen, who are now attacking ships in the Red Sea. Iran and the attack that we saw just a day ago, where this was the 3rd anniversary or the 4th anniversary, if I'm not wrong, of Soleimani's death. And we are looking at Iran now showing intent in how it is using these proxies to respond to Israel, whether it's in the Red Sea or on land with the rocket attacks from Lebanon. We are looking at a very serious threat for Israel. How do you see Israel recalibrate its strategy and forces with this multi-pronged attack that it faces today, not just from Hamas, but from various other quarters as well? And while you say that Lebanon has not reacted, Hezbollah chief had made it very clear, Richard, that should Israel attack anybody in Lebanon or on Lebanese soil, then there will be a response. Should we expect a response from Hezbollah, a major one at that, against Israel?
Yeah, I think the reason for your second question first, the reason why Hezbollah has not responded forcefully, even though they had vowed that they would do so if there was any sort of strike like we saw this week against al-Aruri, is because Hezbollah does not want to start the war beyond what it is already doing on the daily rockets and missiles firing from the north. They understand that the Israelis, if prompted, will retaliate with major force. And I don't think Hezbollah wants to be decimated. And I don't think the Iranians really want Hezbollah to be decimated. They want that force to remain intact to threaten Israel. And so I think the Hezbollah forces are going to wait for Israel to initiate an escalation rather than give Israel the pretext to launch a massive counterstrike against Lebanon. But when we zoom back out to your Iran question, I think it's important to remember Iran is not a threat just to Israel. Iran is a threat to the United States. Iran is a threat to the United Kingdom. Iran is a threat to India. Iran is a threat to all Western nations, all like-minded democracies who want to see rules-based international orders, who want to make sure that there is peace and security throughout the Indian Ocean, throughout the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, to make sure that there are secure lanes of shipping for all of our global commerce. And of course, Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. And so Iran continues to push towards the nuclear weapons threshold. We've seen in the last couple of weeks the report out of the UN nuclear watchdog telling us that they have dramatically increased their enrichment production at the high levels of enrichment. This is very worrisome. And I think we should all be cautious that a lot of this is a great weapon of mass distraction as Iran continues to pursue weapons of mass destruction. And we can't allow the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism to develop one of the most lethal, dangerous weapons in the world. And so as we see Iran direct threats against maritime traffic, against commercial vessels that have nothing to do with Israel, we're going to have to stand together, not just against the Houthis in Yemen, but have a united front against Iran as well.
Well, on the Iran front, Richard, maybe India has a very different approach, because while you say Iran is a threat to India, India certainly is engaging Tehran. New Delhi certainly engages Tehran. We have our own reasons. India's reasons are to do with the AFPAC region, particularly Pakistan, and India's access to Afghanistan only through Iran. So it might work a little differently, but where do you see India play, or do you see India play a role in these conflicts where maybe India is a little more better positioned to engage all countries, because all of them engage in New Delhi, whether if it is Israel or, for that matter, Palestine, or the neighboring region, whether it's Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, very important partner of India today, and Iran.
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why I believe that India and the United States should stand together and understand the threat from Iran. I understand that for a number of years, there was a very narrow-minded focus on developing the Chabahar port as an access point to supply ground transportation into Afghanistan. Obviously, with the fall of Afghanistan and the rise of the Taliban, that project doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. And we need to recognize that Iran is closely aligned with China against Indian interests. They are sharing weapons, they are sharing technology. China has made Iran part of its Belt and Road Initiative. They have obviously a past missile cooperation, not just with North Korea, but with the Pakistanis as well. And so if you look at this, Iran being the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world with ties to many terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, you see that there is a common threat in Iran that is not just for the United States or for Israel, but is also for India in the long term. Look at what they're doing right now to threaten international shipping. You've seen the attacks just miles off of India's coast on the west. This is something that will continue if we don't stand up to it. Iran will play nice with anybody who tries to appease them for a while, but ultimately always ends up biting the hand that feeds them, because this is ultimately an expansionist, revolutionary, radical regime that is all about the Islamic Revolution of 1979. They're not here to have tea and crumpets and play nice. They're here to disrupt, to foment conflict, to sponsor terrorism, to develop their missile program, and ultimately have nuclear weapons. And if anybody in India today believes that Iran is a potential friend, trust me, once Iran develops nuclear weapons, you will understand the true threat, not just to the West, but to India as well.
Well, Richard, we'll talk about Israel and Hamas, but before that, let's just talk about the attempts by the United States of America to form a maritime bloc to protect waters in the Red Sea against attacks from various quarters, particularly the Houthis of Yemen. But President Biden was unable to really form that bloc. What, according to you, are the reasons for countries being reluctant in forming this bloc, in coming together in this fight against not just the Hamas, but particularly in protecting the waters around Israel, around Palestine, particularly the Red Sea?
Well, ultimately, unfortunately, terrorism threats can work against many countries. And for countries that have a Hezbollah threat potentially domestically, that have IRGC, Revolutionary Guard Corps assets inside their countries, for countries that are afraid that their ships or any sort of commercial traffic heading towards their countries might get targeted by Iran, I think that they're afraid of these Iranian-directed threats. And so ultimately, I think they also know that in the end, there's only a handful of countries that can provide the kind of naval support that is needed in this kind of a mission. This is not exactly the counter-piracy mission that we had over the last decade, where you just need a number of ships to patrol the waters and chase down pirate boats. We're talking about anti-ship missiles, cruise missiles, suicide drones being launched from land in Yemen. You need special types of naval assets that have ballistic missile defense, cruise missile defense capabilities on board those ships. And you need to have enough of them patrolling to be able to intercept all those threats. We don't have enough ships ourselves. We have 3 destroyers right now manning the Red Sea. The UK has provided a destroyer. France has a frigate. That's about all the assets that we have available. And we see missiles are still getting through, drones are still getting through. So ultimately, this idea of playing defense in the Red Sea is not practical. It's not a solution. We're going to have an offensive military response inside Yemen with additional military deterrence and economic pressure put on Iran to stop what they are doing, because this is not the Houthis taking these actions. This is ultimately Iran directing the Houthis to take these actions.
And when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war, there's a lot of conversation about proportionality and that there can be no proportionality when it comes to war. But at the end of the day, Richard, there are many civilians who are losing lives in Gaza. North Gaza has been razed to the ground, almost razed to the ground. And now we see an offensive in south of Gaza. So what happens to the civilian population? Where does this end? How does this end?
Well, I think the Israelis have been very clear that the military objective remains the removal of Hamas from Gaza. And so there's any number of, I've heard estimates of 30,000 military forces that Hamas has. If you look at Israeli estimates, maybe a third of them are dead at this point, maybe more. A lot of their tunnel infrastructure has been destroyed. Their leadership, they're obviously hunting down to remove command and control so that those who are at mid and lower levels might surrender, give up the fight. We've seen a lot of pictures of surrender happening in Gaza. Those are the targets the Israelis are after. Doctrines of proportionality require you to do as much as possible to minimize civilian casualties. But in a war zone where Hamas uses human shields, that is very difficult. And in the laws of war, the minute a combatant takes control of a civilian infrastructure and uses it as part of their war tactics, it loses its protections under the Geneva Conventions. And so Israel has been conducting this according to the laws of war. They've been doing all they can to minimize civilian casualties in a very difficult environment to do that, with the ultimate objective being Hamas's destruction, their removal from power in Gaza, and ensuring that nothing in Gaza can again launch something like we saw on October 7th.
Well, again, a lot of debate around whether if all the buildings that Israel is saying were occupied by Hamas were indeed occupied by Hamas. at the end of the day, Richard, there are too many civilian deaths, too many children dying in Gaza. Should there be a tactical way of moving forward? And where is the conversation or negotiations for the release of hostages? Because it doesn't seem like there has been any headway in terms of the conversations that took place with Egypt mediating.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously remember the recent memories of places like Mosul and Raqqa when the United States and its coalition allies were fighting ISIS and trying to destroy the ISIS caliphate. Of course, we know there were no civilian casualties in those battles. That I'm sarcastic right now because, of course, there were civilian casualties in all of those battles. That is what happens when a terrorist organization takes control of civilian areas, and those who are under threat of terrorism from that terrorist organization fight back. We do all we can according to our values, according to the laws of war, to avoid civilian casualties. But you can't just sit there and be a victim of terrorism all day long. India should know that better than most countries. And so I think we return to the doctrine that Israel needs to remove Hamas from power. They do need to ensure that they're following the laws of war. All I've seen is that they are following the laws of war and doctrines of proportionality. And they also have a responsibility to discuss what comes after the war and work with the United States and other partners like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, those who have never been sponsors of Hamas, like the Qataris or the Turks, who should not be involved in what comes next, to decide on sort of what does come next. What is the future for the people of Gaza who will still be there the day after Hamas falls? How do you ensure there isn't a return to some sort of a Hamasistan-like state in Gaza? As far as the hostage negotiations, obviously the more Hamas feels that it is on the verge of collapse, they will be prompted to start a negotiation. I think right now they still are betting that all international isolation and pressure that they can build at the UN through their allies will somehow halt the offensive before Hamas is destroyed. And so you've seen the Egyptian proposal that essentially saves Hamas from destruction, allows them to reunite with the Fatah Palestinian Authority, step back and back some sort of a technocratic government. That's not going to fly with the Israelis to have Hamas leaders survive this war and have their political and military infrastructure remain intact. So I think obviously we hope for the hostages release. We understand that the hostages are part of the horror, the terror that we saw unleashed on October 7th. And so anything that Hamas chooses to do with the hostages will ultimately be part of their psychological warfare, their terrorism, and perhaps ultimately their last card to play before their destruction.
Right. We'll talk about the two-state solution. I'll ask you, but before that, you gave examples of Iraq, but the examples are very different because they're not comparable. In Gaza, civilians are, if they're being used as human shields, as Israel says, by the Hamas, then on the other hand, they're also not being allowed to leave Gaza. There is no way out for those civilians who want to just live. How does one work when you have Hamas using them and you have nowhere to go when Israelis are bombing? So there has to be a way out to ensure lesser deaths of civilians, especially women and children.
Yeah, that's a great point you're raising, and I have been very saddened by the lack of international outrage on Egypt. Egypt could open its border at any moment. You wouldn't be having refugees walk into Cairo if Egypt opened its border. There's something called the Sinai Desert that sits between most of Egypt and Gaza. If they simply open their border, all these people who want to leave, who are trapped potentially in southern Gaza, who would want to get out, at least temporarily, into refugee camps, could do so. It wouldn't disrupt Egyptian life one bit. Why won't they open that border at the south? Why won't they do that? It's horrible. It's horrifying.
I'll tell you. But I'll tell you why. Because I was in Rafah. Rafah crossing has two gates. One is on the Egyptian side. The other one is used to be controlled by Hamas, but also now being monitored by Israel. There are two reasons why they say that. One, towards Egypt and the Sinai, which is where they had many Palestinian refugees during the war as well, and there are many Palestinians that Egypt hosts. If that happens, there would be certain number of Hamas, or if there is no Hamas tomorrow, and if there is no group such as Hamas, there would still be people who suffer the ravages of war and would be Israel haters. So you will have a war that will be reaching Egyptian border. Egypt does not want that. Secondly, there is a thinking within the Palestinians, as also the bordering countries of Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, that should they take in Palestinians as refugees from Gaza, most of the civilians would leave. And if that happens, Gaza would be for Israel's taking. There is the idea of a two-state solution for Palestinians who have lived in that land. And Gaza, might I add, has half the population in Gaza are actually refugees from other parts of Palestine, where they were displaced many years ago. So that's the thinking. That's the reason why this is not a solution. But it's not like Israel is opening its borders to civilians as well. Nobody's opening borders to civilians at the end of the day. Civilians, very sad situation, seeing only the critically injured getting out of the Rafah crossing to reach certain hospitals in Egypt. So very sad situation for civilians who have no choice and who've not asked to be part of such a war.
I'll just say that you've described quite aptly how the Arab countries continue to use Palestinians who live in Gaza as political pawns in a political war on Israel. And yet, there's no condemnation of that conduct. There is no UN resolution. There's no Arab country that speaks out. There's no Western country that speaks out. No one calls out Egypt for that. No one calls out Jordan for that, or any other Arab country. And so I think we need to have an honest conversation here. This is not on Israel. Israel just suffered the worst attack on Jews in history since the Holocaust. Why is this on Israel? Israel is trying to defend itself. And so I appreciate that this is a horrific situation, and we want to see the war end quick. Of course, the war could end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders. But I think important for all to understand, this is not on Israel. Egypt has a responsibility. They've decided not to take that responsibility. Jordan and others have decided not to take their responsibility. The mythology of refugee status inside Gaza. Remember, Egypt controlled Gaza between 1948 and 1967. The idea that 1.8, 1.9 million of 2.1 million people in Gaza who have lived there for decades are refugees is mythology. It's all part of the idea of trying to delegitimize the state of Israel. This is why the UN's refugee agency organization in the West Bank and Gaza have always been part of the problem to actually achieve a two-state solution. So I just think it's important for us to have an honest conversation about these issues.
Final question, Richard. With all this, with the war, where do you see the conversation on a two-state solution? And do you see a forward movement anytime soon on actually a political solution to the question of Palestine, to the question of resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict, and looking at defining borders and boundaries between Israel and Palestine for
Yeah, I think there's two answers here. I think there's an emotional human answer, and I think there is a policy answer as well. On the human level, I think we should really sort of think about, maybe for viewers in India, think about one of the worst terrorist attacks in Indian history, and think about who perpetrated the attack. And imagine within a month or 2 months of that horrific incident, you would go to the people of India and say, why aren't you making peace? Why aren't you ready to have some sort of recognition and concessions to those that just destroyed so much human life in India? An example for Jews, for Israel, would be, imagine within 2 months of the Holocaust ending, international pressure on Jews to say, why won't you give concessions to Germany? Why won't you have some sort of two-state solutions with the Germans? The Nazis have fallen. And so I think there's an understanding that on a domestic level in Israel, this idea of a conversation of a two-state solution right after October 7th is sort of a fantasy. It's not going to happen. It's very angering to Israelis. Now, on a policy level, how could you actually achieve a two-state solution right now? A Palestinian Authority that controls the West Bank also sponsors terrorism. They put people who commit terrorist attacks against Israel on their payroll. That we call it in the West pay for slay. It's an incredible, horrific program. They also allow their textbooks to continue to incite their population to hate Jews, to hate Israelis. They also depend on that same UN refugee organization for much of the population to avoid actually doing the hard work of state building, of institution building. Meanwhile, Hamas is in the West Bank. Islamic Jihad is in the West Bank. Iran has been fomenting violence there for many years. And we actually see the Israeli military operating there on an almost daily basis against those terror cells. So the idea that we could simply, wave a magic wand, snap our fingers, and have a two-state solution today, I think defies both the human aspects of this life after October 7th, but also the policy realities of the problems in the Palestinian Authority.
Maybe, Richard, that's the whole problem. India faces terrorism from Pakistan. Pakistan is a state. Germany is a state. Because there is a terror organization does not mean that an entire population should be denied statehood. And that's the whole conversation when it comes to October 7th or before October 7th. There were children who were killed in the West Bank, and West Bank does not have Hamas. And yet that happened.
That's not true. That's not true. West Bank has Hamas.
Forget about Netanyahu. No, this is recorded. No, it might, but it is not control. It is not controlled by the Hamas as Gaza is. Gaza was administered by Hamas. Having said that, it's not about Netanyahu as prime minister, but Ben-Gvir as the interior minister, and his actions of in the past 2 years have been rather provocative themselves. And it's not like Israelis themselves were very happy with what Ben-Gvir was doing, or even for that matter, the statements that he's making post-October 7th. Their own government is troubled by it. The United States of America actually yesterday came out and put out a statement saying that we do not agree with Ben-Gvir's statements. Israel also should be looked at, and no matter what the problem is, India suffers terrorism, but it is a state we are handling. The population cannot be denied statehood.
Well, I think just to clarify for your viewers, you've basically said that the reason why there's no state, why the Palestinians are suffering, is because of Benjamin Netanyahu being prime minister and far right-wing ministers, who I don't agree with, by the way, on many of the statements. But just to understand, just a couple of years ago, Israel elected. This is a very important point. Just a couple of years ago, Israel elected the most centrist, diverse government in its history. An Arab party, an Arab Israeli party, joined that government. Netanyahu was not prime minister. Ben-Gvir, Smotrich were not in the government. This was a center-left government. And we saw the same commitment to terrorism and violence and hatred out of the Palestinian side in the West Bank. So the idea that Netanyahu is a problem or Ben-Gvir is a problem, this is something that ultimately...
I'm reversing the question. I reversed it. I just said that just because this exists does not mean that an entire population should be denied statehood. There's a huge difference. In the contact took place does not mean we can rip a country off its statehood. India suffered terrorism at the hands of Pakistan for decades. But nobody can rip a country off statehood. And similarly, I'm saying that because incidents took place does not mean an entire population should be denied. Is all over here is don't. They should be eliminated. But I'm just saying that there are citizens, there are people, there are civilians involved, that somebody has to look at the civilians, innocent civilians who maybe just want to live in peace.
Yes, and I pray that one day they have leaders who are willing to make peace with Israel.
I agree. I agree. Um, just final question to you in terms of this year, where do you see the war headed? Do you see, or can you imagine a moment where we will see the elimination of Hamas, not just within Gaza or the West Bank, but also the leadership that is living in various other parts of the world, even if we don't want to name the countries, but we could say Qatar,
Yeah.
where they are.
Yes. I think that the strike in Lebanon was certainly a warning shot to all of us in the world that the Israelis will be hunting down all Hamas leaders by the end of this war, and perhaps even after the war ends, much as they did the perpetrators of the massacre at the Olympics in 1972 in Munich, as we recall. And so for Hamas leaders who live in Doha, Qatar, for Hamas leaders that are operating perhaps in Turkey, those in Lebanon, perhaps in North Africa as well, elsewhere, I think you will see more of these types of strikes to eliminate all the leaders of Hamas, whether they claim to be political leaders or military leaders.
Is this also a wake-up call to Israel that they can never let their guard down?
I think that's absolutely the case. I think that's absolutely the case. There is this mental dichotomy of this melting pot democracy, thriving economy that we call the startup nation for the last several years, the tech industry that was growing in Tel Aviv, the acceptance into the Western world, into Europe, the Abraham Accords, finally seeing Arab-Israeli peace, the acceptance of Israel as a legitimate state in the Middle East by its Arab neighbors. All of this, I believe, was creating a false sense of security for Israel. And I think they've learned a horrific lesson on October 7th.
So normalization with the Arab world is not tantamount to complacency when it comes to security.
Right. They're not mutually exclusive, of course. I think that Iran is ultimately the primary driver of these threats, remember. And so this isn't because Saudi Arabia was thinking about making peace that Hamas does something. It's not that the UAE has signed an accord that has weakened Israel's security. Israel's security has been strengthened by all of these normalization moves. Iran doesn't want to see this happen, and so they are working overtime to disrupt all of these peace efforts, in addition to the fact that they want to see their own hegemony in the region grow and to foment more chaos in the region. So I think important for us to continue to do all we can to encourage steps towards peace and normalization in the region. Having Saudi-Israeli peace feels far off right now in the context of the Gaza war. I hope it's not something that has to be too far off. We can get back to that track, because ultimately that will be the biggest response to Iran to isolate that regime is by continuing these normalization agreements.
Richard Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspective on what is happening, what has happened, and what could happen in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.